IPA members, IPA supporters, friends of integrity in science, thank you all very much for being here tonight with us in Sydney at this very, very exciting IPA event, the launch of Climate Change the Facts 2017. It's wonderful to have you all with us. It's particularly wonderful to have you with us if you've signed up as a member of the IPA. If you haven't signed up as a member of the IPA, I strongly encourage you to go and see Jen Campbell, who will help you sign up to the IPA. We've got a very special offer tonight for those that are either existing members who would like to renew their membership or those who have not yet made the wonderful decision to become a member of the wonderful organisation that is the Institute of Public Affairs. And that is, for $99 you can get an 18-month membership with a free copy of a book which you might be familiar with given that you're here tonight, the 2014 edition of Climate Change the Facts. So please go and see Jen tonight. To add to the Climate Change the Facts series, the third of which we're here to celebrate tonight. I want to pay special tribute to a few very special people in the room tonight. Number one, first and foremost, of course we have to thank our editor of this wonderful edition of Climate Change the Facts, Jennifer Marohasy. Jennifer has done a wonderful job. I'm not sure how many of you in this room have experience in editing an edition of a book, but I can tell you it takes a number of hours of blood, sweat and tears putting something like this together. But not only has Jennifer done a wonderful job as editor, she has also used the relationships that she has here in Australia and around the world, bringing together a world-class list of authors. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for all the work that you've done. And I, of course, run a bit of a risk here in nominating a favourite author, but I think it's particularly momentous that we have for this edition Clive James, who has written a chapter for this book. All, of course, due to Jennifer's work. So thank you, Jennifer, for all that you do for science and all that you have done for this book. Now, of course, copies of the book are for sale tonight if you would like to buy a copy, and if you would like for Jennifer and also Professor Peter Ridd, who is with us tonight, to sign that book, please take that opportunity. They're for sale outside for $29.95. And Jennifer and Peter will be signing the book at this table over on my right at the end of tonight's formal proceedings. We've also got copies of the 2014 book for $24.95, although you get that free. I think I might have mentioned that with the IPA membership. So maybe just join as an IPA member and you get the $24.95 2014 version free. One thing that I'm very excited to announce tonight, and something which is news for all of you who are here at tonight's book launch, is that we are actually selling out of the first print run of this edition. Sales of the book started last week, and I'm delighted to announce that the 200 books that we have brought up for tonight's proceedings are the last 200 from the 1,500 that were printed from this print run. So thank you. Thank you to all of you who have already bought a book. Now that brings me, of course, to another very important person who's in the room tonight, Alan Jones. Alan Jones, the last 2 mornings on 2GB, has interviewed Jennifer Marohasy yesterday morning and Peter Ridd this morning. And each time Alan Jones talked about the book, we sold more than 100 copies of the book during the broadcast. So thank you very much to Alan Jones. This is a wonderful book, and I'm delighted to be here tonight to celebrate the publication of this book. And please trust me when I say that it's not just because I have a chapter in the book myself. As proud as I am of that, and I know that our Executive Director, John Roscombe, is also incredibly proud of this book too. He mentioned to me earlier today to mention to you that he was very sorry that he couldn't be here. He is talking about the impact of Trump and Brexit, a couple of relatively important events in world history in the last couple of years that have occurred at an event that he has down in Melbourne. So he's very, very sorry that he couldn't be here, but I hope that I do a good enough job in John's stead. So thank you very much for being here. It's wonderful to be here to celebrate Climate Change, the Facts 2017, to celebrate science and to celebrate the debate that must continue to go on in climate science in this country. And without further ado, I'd please like you to all welcome Jennifer Marohasy to come and speak about the book.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you for contributing such an important chapter about the importance of freedom of speech to this book. I do love coming to Sydney, and I do love coming and seeing the Opera House. And of course, because the waters of Sydney Harbour lap the Opera House, I can see the sea level rise on an incoming tide. On an incoming tide. I was down there this morning and the tide was coming in. There's actually about a 1.5 metre change between high and low tide at the Opera House today. I also love watching the Opera House and the fireworks over the Opera House each New Year's Eve, but I've never actually yet seen an inundation from sea level rise of the Opera House, though I did warn Scott Hargraves, who's been so important for the production of this book. Is Scott here in the room? He's selling books outside. I warned Scott about not booking the Opera House for the book launch because I've heard so much about this 2-storey high rise in sea level, and we wouldn't want to be washed away tonight, would we? So we're here instead. And thank you so much to Scott for booking this venue and organising tonight's launch. Is it just a story? I mean, people have favourite stories, and this idea of sea level rise and being washed away, is this story that excites people? Other people have their comfort story that they love. Some people love stories that make them feel a little bit smug. And I was wondering whether the psychologist Anthony York, when he was writing in the Australian Spectator Online last week and accusing me of raking over the data and suggesting that my raking over the data, this was a psychologist writing, he was suggesting that in raking over the data I was exhibiting signs of shock and denial about the poor state of our polluted planet and denying rising sea levels. Me raking over the data. I am actually going to show you some sea level data tonight, sea level data from Fort Denison. And of course, we have got some fantastic long sea level record. The sea level record for Fort Denison goes back to 1886, so I think it's actually worth raking over. I'm going to show you how they homogenise it, but I'm also going to show you the actual measurements. The reality is that sea level doesn't always go up. It actually cycles a little bit. And Simon, you've taken the book away. I was going to hold it up. Chapter 3 in this fantastic book. One of my favourite chapters is Chapter 3 by Nicholas Scaffetta. It talks about natural climate cycles and what drives them. It's a great chapter. With respect to sea level at Fort Denison, for example, we have daily cycles, we have monthly cycles, we have the El Niño cycles, and of course those cycles also affect global temperatures. So actually when temperatures spike, globally, you can actually see the sea levels at Fort Denison go down. This is not, my first slide's not a sea level slide, it's a slide from this book, from chapter 12, and it shows you the satellite record This is the Uah Satellite Record, which is compiled by a fellow called Dr. Roy Spencer. He wrote Chapter 12 for us. He works with the NASA scientists from the Uah Satellite to actually compile this data. So please, another one of my favourite chapters, Chapter 12 in this book. Now, the satellite data, this is probably our best data of global temperatures. And what we've got is a spike here in 1998, and then another one in 2016. And in between, you can see something that we never hear about on our ABC, the pause. We've got the pause. Now, this is the best, probably the best measure of global representation of global temperatures. It only goes back to 1979, shows these two spikes and the pause. Now, we know that seasonally adjusted carbon dioxide levels sort of show a general linear trend. Do you think carbon dioxide has caused these spikes? Did somebody say no? It doesn't look like there's much of a correlation between carbon dioxide levels over the last few years and the global temperature record. And this is a temperature record that is also used by the IPCC in their last 2013 report in one component of it. If you actually go to another one of my favourite chapters in this book, which is Chapter 19, co-authored by John Abbott, who's here tonight. John, would you just like to stand up? John wrote Chapter 19, which actually, thank you, explains the physics of carbon dioxide and talks also about another important greenhouse gas which is really neglected in the IPCC reports, which is water vapour. And his chapter with John Nicol in this book talks about why there's maybe not going to be this direct relationship between carbon dioxide and global temperatures. I've got a lot of favourite chapters in this book. Another favourite chapter in this book, Chapter 21 by Bob Carter. And his wife and son are here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Where's Anne? I can't see you. Oh, thank you, Anne, for all your help. And Jeremy, thank you for being here. Yeah. So Bob in Chapter 21 actually talks about lunar nodal cycles, and they're 18.6 years long. And do you know how long that pause ran for? 18.6 years. Ken Ring, who wrote Chapter 4 in this book, which is another one of my favourite chapters, actually predicted this. He actually predicted the El Nino corresponding with the lunar minimum standstill that occurred in November 2015, and he said the following winter is going to be a very mild one in the Northern Hemisphere, which of course when you add up things globally, because Ken's always predicting rainfall locally, contributed very much to this spike. Imagine Tony Jones from the ABC even showing us the actual temperature data, talking about what might have caused it, acknowledging the 18.6 years between the spikes. They still haven't even acknowledged that temperatures. This is the end of last year. This has been updated by Roy since, but I wanted to show you this directly from our. Roy only publishes his charts in black and white, but we convinced him to let us do it in colour for the book. But the reality is, it is important that we understand what the measurements look like, that we've got people like Roy Spencer collating this data. Extraordinarily, in the last, I think it's 3 months ago now, a peer-reviewed paper came out. What do you think they've done with this? Homogenised it. The already published data, they've created a 33% increase in warming between 1998 and the current. The data's been homogenised and it's been accepted in the peer review literature. It may be okay while we're maybe a bit comfortable and well fed to be tampering. I don't actually think it's ever acceptable to be fiddling with the actual measurements and presenting remodelled data as actual measurements, which happens all the time in climate science. But imagine if we were at war and people were relying on homogenised sea level data, homogenised temperature data, because that's what we have, that's what the official institutions rely on mostly at the moment, homogenised temperature and sea level data. Now, back in 1944, General Eisenhower actually ignored the consensus of the US meteorologists with respect to the best day for the landing for D-Day. He ignored that advice. He went with the forecast. A British meteorologist, James Stagg, went against the consensus and he said, look, we're going to have stormy weather, bad weather that whole week. There's only one day you'll be able to have a successful D-Day landing. It's the 5th of June 1944 that they decided to plan D-Day as the landing. They had a sort of window of opportunity. They went with the 5th against the consensus and it really changed. It was successful. There was a lull in that week of stormy weather. James Stagg, did understand lunar cycles, not just the sea tides, but also the atmospheric tides. The D-Day landing was planned on the lowest tide on the eve of a full moon for that lunar cycle. If we found ourselves at war again, would there be a name that we could recognise as, somebody who could give us reliable information, for example, in the area of weather forecasting, because we know, well, at least they say that the Germans had no idea what the weather was going to be. In fact, they stood down the troops because on the 3rd and the 4th, the weather was so bad, they couldn't believe that the British would actually believe that there was going to be a lull on the 5th and land. A knowledge of weather and climate is important for the success of a civilization, for planning for crops and harvest, for dam management. Talk to anybody from Brisbane. That flooding of Brisbane in January 2011, it was so unnecessary. I don't believe it would have occurred if there hadn't been this obsession with this human-caused catastrophic global warming and the idea that the wrong-headed idea that the dams would never fill again. It's why a reference book like this is so important. I do rake over data as this is, I can't stand down without showing you some more data. This is actually a slide of sea level rise at Fort Denison in Sydney Harbour since 1886. Okay? And we have got these cycles. Okay? We've got the cycles. You've got the daily cycles, the monthly cycles, and these cycles really reflect changes in the position of the moon and the sun and a few other things. This is downloaded from the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website. It's a bit harder to find than the homogenised version. They have run a linear trend line through it, and it says that we have 0.65 millimetre per year. 65 centimetres, so 6.5 centimetres per century sea level rise. Okay, at Fort Denison. What's that? Sea level rise, like the rate and magnitude of temperature rise during the late 20th century, is well within expected natural climate cycles operating. And if you look at the homogenised sea levels, and there's some discussion of those in chapter 14 of this book, Matt Ridley's chapter, you can see even the homogenised data, you're only looking at a 34 centimetre per year sea level rise. Matt talks about, 34 centimetres per century sea level rise is what Matt Ridley talks about. And of course, Bob Carter talked about how they homogenised the record to achieve a very similar level with his sea level work for Fort Denison. So even that 34 centimetres per century, thank you for correcting me, level of sea level rise is well within the rate and magnitude of what you would expect from a natural climate cycle. Chapter 21 by Ian Plimer talks about the deep history of the geological history of the Earth and how in past times there's been sea level rise of hundreds of metres. For example, go back just 16,000 years when Tasmania was part of the Tasmania was connected to the Australian mainland. I think the real deniers are those who refuse to acknowledge the extent of natural climate cycles. Those who refuse to acknowledge the extent of natural climate cycles. So when you're maybe next in discussion with somebody like them, because there are a lot of them in Sydney, don't only recommend this book, but maybe also ask them about what is the actual level of sea level rise at the Opera House, the waters lapping the Opera House in Sydney Harbour. What's the homogenised rate of sea level rise? And in our deep history over the last few thousand years, the last 16,000 years, what has been the rate of sea level rise in Sydney Harbour? And you can get a lot of that information also from this book. Now, we're not only raking over data tonight with the launch of this book, we also have somebody who's going to talk about the Great Barrier Reef. Peter Ridd, I'm so honoured to introduce you tonight. Peter's a professor of physics at James Cook University in Townsville with a particular interest in coastal oceanography, including human impacts on coral reefs. More recently, Peter has been promoting the requirement for better quality assurance in all areas of science. And Scott Pruitt, who's just now talking about the importance of red teams and blue teams, I wonder if it wasn't that he read a great article by Peter written exactly outlining this need about 7 years ago. Like me and many other people in this room, Peter shares with me Enlightenment values. Peter's published over 100 papers in international science journals and is also the author of Chapter 1, another one of my favourite chapters of this book. The chapter is about the extraordinary resilience of Great Barrier Reef corals. Please join me in welcoming Peter Ridd.
Thanks, Jen. All right, so we're going to talk about the Great Barrier Reef, and you've doubtless heard about all the bleaching that's happened in the last year or two. But I also want to talk about a problem with the quality assurance that we have in science. So in many ways, the mass coral bleaching that we've heard about is a story made in heaven to show the impacts of climate change, because it's spectacular. All the corals die in a great way for newsreel, and it's also plausible because the corals actually do die occasionally when the temperature gets hot. But we need to start with a couple of facts, and the most important fact is that all the corals that live on the Great Barrier Reef, almost all of them, also live in Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, where the water is 1 or 2 degrees hotter. And in fact, they grow faster there. So this graph, we'll go back. This graph shows the water temperature and the growth rate, and you see there's this nice linear growth. The higher the water temperature, the greater the amount of coral growth. So why is it then that occasionally the corals will actually die when things get very hot? Well, the reason is we've got to go into the biology of it, and a coral like these ones here, these branching corals, which tend to get clobbered by the hot water events, and also these massive corals, they're made up of these little polyps, a few millimetres across, and inside that little animal lives a plant called the zooxanthellae, and they actually make the energy for the coral. And it's not entirely understood why, but periodically when the water gets very, very hot, the zooxanthellae actually gets sick or something happens to it, and it needs to be thrown out of the coral, and the coral actually ejects it. And that's a problem because now the coral hasn't got a mechanism of getting energy. But it's not a death sentence. Most of the corals that will actually bleach, because when this happens they bleach, they will actually survive. It's a bit of an analogy with eucalyptus trees. They will often lose their leaves in very water-stressed conditions because that will help them survive. So it's actually a strategy for life rather than a death sentence. Now, the bleaching does occur when the water gets abnormally high for a particular location, but there's not a hard temperature cutoff. For example, a coral which might bleach at 28 degrees where I'm from in Townsville won't bleach at 28 degrees further north where the waters are naturally hotter. They may bleach at 30 degrees there. It's also important to note that the corals are born without zooxanthellae. They take the zooxanthellae in from the water. It's floating around in the water, and they will take the zooxanthellae which will suit them. All right, it's also interesting that it's only these branching corals and the plate corals which are really susceptible to the bleaching, but these tend to get clobbered by everything, including cyclones. So they have a life cycle of maybe 10 or 20 years. If they don't bleach this year, they're very likely to be hit by a cyclone and die from that. On the other hand, these big massive corals like this will live maybe hundreds of years, and they are very unsusceptible to bleaching or cyclones. So these are like the big giant trees in the big forests. These are like the weeds. I often call these the weeds of the reef because they're very susceptible. They have a short life cycle. All right, now, not surprisingly, the corals have learned a thing or two over 200 million years about how to deal with large temperature changes. And it turns out that they can select different types of zooxanthellae in order to make them survive. So there's lots of different types of zooxanthellae. They can take what I call low-octane zoox, and this will give a resistance to bleaching, but they will grow slowly. Or they can take some high-octane zoox, which makes them grow very rapidly, but you could end up being hit by a bleaching event and die. So you can see there's this balancing act which they're trying to do. There's no hard threshold. The same coral will bleach at different temperatures if it have different zooxanthellae. And in addition, when a coral does bleach and expel the zooxanthellae, if it survives, which is quite likely, it will then often take in a different species of zooxanthellae so it can survive into the future. So it's pretty smart, and you'd expect it to be smart, right? Because they've seen this all before. In many ways, the bleaching is like a bushfire. It's very nasty when it happens. A lot of trees will die, but it recovers. And in fact, the Australian bush has grown up, been able to adapt to these sorts of conditions. And the same applies to the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, we should expect, even if there was no climate change whatsoever, that in fact the corals must be able to deal with massive temperature changes, because the corals, they spawn, and the spawn actually floats large distances, many hundreds or even thousands of kilometres. So a coral that spawns here in Townsville may well end up drifting. The spawn will drift to a place where it's hotter by 1 or 2 degrees, or it could drift south where it's colder, or it could drift inshore where it's hotter, or it could drift and settle in a place that's deeper where it's colder, or nearer the surface where it's shallower. And this is 1 or 2 degrees, much more than the temperature change that we've had. So you would expect that they must naturally have to deal with temperature changes, whereas a tree will drop its seed right next to it. It doesn't have to worry about that. So corals do, and this is why I believe that more than any other ecosystem in the world, if there is climate change, anthropogenic or otherwise, the Great Barrier Reef is the one that will be able to take the change. When you actually look at the statistics of coral cover versus time, and you've got to be a little bit sceptical about the stuff before about 1992 because there was a slight change in the methodology. You see in the northern Great Barrier Reef, it comes along and it's crashed in the last few years, right? It's gone down from 20%, it's crashed by about 50%. On the other hand, the central Great Barrier Reef hit its low about 5 years ago, and it has bounced back very, very well. The southern Great Barrier Reef crashed massively after Cyclone Hamish, down to 10%, and there's now 3.5 times more coral on the southern Great Barrier Reef than there was then. For the Great Barrier Reef as a whole, there was also a dip in about 2010-11, but it responded very well. It's come back down with this late bleaching event, but essentially the amount of coral that we've got now is basically the same as what it's been over the last 30 years. So no big deal here at all. When you go back further, corals actually effectively have a little temperature recorder inside them, the strontium-calcium ratio. You can actually look at the temperature when they've lived. So you look at skeletal skeletons of the corals, and when Captain Cook was sailing up the coast, in fact, the temperature was probably pretty much exactly the same as what it is today. All right, now, some scientists say, including some of my colleagues at my own university, that bleaching never used to occur before the 1980s, all right? Now, this must be rubbish, but it is interesting that something else also happened in the 1980s. We discovered a different thing which is equally spectacular, and that's mass coral spawning, right? It occurs on the first full moon in November, a few days after the full moon, and this is what it looks like. The egg and the sperm bundles float to the surface in a very spectacular fashion. You can see it from aircraft, you can see it from space, and we didn't know about it before the 1980s. So, like coral bleaching, which never occurred before the 1980s, you've got to ask the question, did corals discover sex in 1982? Or is this actually caused by, climate change? Or is it just possible that this has been going on for a couple of 100 million years, just like the bleaching? So you have the situation where mass coral bleaching is bad, it's because you drove your car. Mass coral spawning is a wonder of nature. You can't have it both ways. The reality is that we never really got to study the Great Barrier Reef until the 1960s. We had scuba gear, we had outboard motors, and of course, as soon as you have scientists studying it, you'll find that there's going to be something wrong with it, and that's what's actually happened. But there's a lot of other dodgy science on the Great Barrier Reef, and I wish I had a few hours to go into it. The stuff on the runoff from the land, the sediment and the nutrients, is unbelievable, but here's just a little bit. This was a paper which showed essentially the coral growth rate with time from 1990 to 2000. You see it coming along and collapsing. This looked very dodgy, so we spent about a year looking at this, and we found two massive errors with the data. When we corrected those, there is no drop in the calcification rate.
Had that first graph been
homogenised? All this is peer-reviewed. More on that in a second, okay? So I can talk about that later. Right. There's another paper that came out also looking at calcification rate, and they found since the 1940s about a 10% increase in the offshore and mid-shelf reefs. That's 99% of the coral. For 5% of the reef, for 1% of the reef, the inshore corals, there was a 5% decrease. So for 99% of the reef, there's been a 10% increase. But these guys, they don't dwell on this obviously good news. Their concluding remarks is, our new findings nevertheless continue to raise concerns, blah, 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 possibly reflecting the effects of CO2-driven climate change. So even something which is obviously good news ends up being bad news. So we have a massive problem with quality assurance of the science, right? These are all peer-reviewed, right? And some of you guys might think that peer review is a really impressive process where maybe a dozen scientists get together and they pore over the data for weeks on end to make sure it's right. Well, it's not. Peer review, generally speaking, is a quick read by two people. You don't necessarily even know who they are. And you've got to ask the question, is this good enough quality assurance when you're going to spend $1 billion to fix the reef or do whatever you're going to do? Should you be a little bit more careful than that? Well, there's some really good news. It's really, really good news, right? This is a guy who's a mathematician at Stanford. He's into the biomedical area, and he published this paper which says why most published research findings are false, all right? He also had another paper explaining why, in fact, about 85% of science resources are wasted because they're basing it on science which is exaggerated or just plain wrong. Then there's even more good news, like this paper which came out where drug companies, when they're going to take a piece of promising university research, like a university might say, this chemical seems to cure cancer, the drug companies will then do what you'd expect them to do. They will check to see whether that is right, because they're going to spend $1 billion taking this to market. Well, it turns out that when they did this, 20% of the time they found that the original work was right, right? So this is an appalling situation, but I reckon this is great news, in fact. More good news, the editor of The Lancet, and I love this quote, this has actually become a very famous quote, in fact. He has said, best journal in the world for medicine, the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample size, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, etc., science has taken a turn towards darkness. All right, now you may be wondering why I think this is magical news. And the reason is that those people are right at the centre of the scientific systems. They're the pillars of the scientific system. They're not like me or like Bob Carter, who was on the outside, excluded, never allowed to debate, right? Bob Carter was never allowed to get in there and do the sorts of things which he should have been allowed to do. And the fact they're inside the system is a great sign, because it means that I can now ask, and we have to now ask, if half the papers in the general scientific literature is likely to be wrong, is it likely that half of the marine science and the environmental science literature is wrong? Do we have a decent system of replicating and checking? No. Is there a chance that many of the marine science are partially driven by ideology? I'll let you work that out. Is there a chance that peer review amongst this group is self-selecting of the dominant idea? And is there a robust debate without intimidation? I think not. All right, so what we've got to do is work out how we can fix this system. We need to compare the system of quality assurance which we use in science with the legal system, where we have these guys here, these coal miners, these guys are accused of killing the Great Barrier Reef, these are the scientists of the prosecution who are saying you done it, and we would always appoint somebody to challenge the accusation. In addition, we will have a group of people who will sit back and listen to both sides of the argument, and some dude who will actually see whether this has been done in a fair way. All right, this is what our system looks like. We never guarantee that the other side of the argument will be seen. We then go further because we then stack this thing with people on one side. This could be the IPCC. There are also some reef committees that look at reef science. They do exactly that. Then we go even worse, and we'll then pretend to have proper reviews. And of course, there is only one sort of judge that will allow this sort of to go on, and this is our science system. This is our science system, and we've got to do something about this, right? We've got to get it back to looking like this. And this is where, and I'm going to conclude on some even better news, and I think that this is Scott Pruitt, the new Environmental Protection Agency chief in the United States, Donald Trump's appointment. He wants red teams, blue teams, right? Red teams, blue teams just means this, right? He's the red team, he's the blue team. And it's easy enough to do. Now, this will have a massive effect. Not only will there be challenging of the science, but even more important, it will become respectable to challenge the science. Bob Carter was never allowed to be respectable. And if the blue team know that there'll be a Bob Carter who must be listened to, they will then be a little bit more careful in some of the absolute rubbish that comes out. At the moment, they don't have to listen to the Bob Carters. There's no need. They've tied the entire debate up, so there's no need to listen. And what we've got to do now, actually, is spend more time arguing about the process and possibly a little less time arguing about the science itself. If we argue about the process and we get the scientific systems fixed, we will win in this debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to both Dr. Jennifer Marohasy and Professor Peter Ridd. I think that was absolutely fascinating, but I think it was so interesting I might ask you a few questions about it, so I'll come and join you over on the couch for some of those right now. Thank you. I'll give you that one.
Thank you.
So, I followed everything that both of you said and I didn't get lost at any point. But for some of you in the room who might not be as well versed in the science of climate change as both of you are, that was a joke, by the way. Science is definitely not my background, and I'll admit that at some points I did get a little bit lost, and certainly reading the book, I get a little bit lost. So if I'm able to admit that, I'm sure that others in the room will be able to do the same thing. So I just wanted to take you both back to the beginning of some of the core arguments that both of you make. And Jennifer, first to start with you, homogenisation to me seems crazy. It just seems like something that would never happen in a modern community that values science and thinks that data is important. And if you want to make conclusions from the data, then surely this idea that you adjust temperatures, for instance, is something that's just not acceptable. Why is it that it happens? What's their justification for doing it? And why is it that there aren't more people talking about just how bad that is?
Okay, thank you for that question. I certainly, when I first came to the ACORN data, that's the official data set for Australia, John Abbott and I, with our rainfall forecasting, we were looking at using that like most people who are using historical data, looking at inputting that into our models. But we realised it wasn't the actual measurements and that we had to use the raw data. And using the raw data, it just creates some complications because the data sets are of different lengths. Sometimes, for example, very often, temperatures were recorded at a post office, and then they moved the temperature recording equipment to the airport. And so you do have a discontinuity in the data. And what it would be in those situations, if you want a continuous record for somewhere like Deniliquin, to just match them up, for example, and there may be a need for an adjustment to match them up. But what we find is that the matching up always seems to result in the cooling of the past, even when you actually look at where there's overlap, that shouldn't necessarily be the case. And for places like Rutherglen, where there was never any move of the weather station, they nevertheless run these statistical tests, decide that there must have been a station move, even though the catalogue says there was no station move, and even though there's all this evidence to show there was none, there was never ever a station move. They say that there are discontinuities in the data and that they have to therefore adjust the data. And it's extraordinary. They keep adjusting the data so it fits the theory of anthropogenic global warming.
I think that's absolutely scandalous, but I wondered, Peter, if I could bring you in now and to ask you whether one of the reasons for this is failing in the scientific process, in particular peer review. Is that one of the reasons why this is happening, or is it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what's happening. They can get away with this all the time, and they continually get away with it. They know that nobody is ever going to do those checks. You know, I mean, essentially the only reason this has been as exposed is that Jennifer Marohasy, through the IPA and the sponsors, has actually put a bit of heat on this. But this should occur as a matter of course. You know, this should be a government funded. If we're being told that the temperatures are rising and the government's going to spend a whole lot of money to do whatever it's got to do, then it should be funding those checking processes. And that, of course, what Scott Pruitt is all about.
We've got a coalition government in power now. They're surely making sure that this is all being fixed, aren't they?
Well, that's one of the most, there's certainly a lot of those MPs who do understand it. And in Queensland, there's a lot of the National Party or that Liberal National Party MPs who do understand this quality assurance problem.
I wanted to ask, in terms of the political process, do you think that there's anything that can be done? You've hinted at this, and do you think that there's more that can or should be done by by government to fix this, or do you think that this is solely a problem within the scientific community?
No, government is going to have to do this. The science community, apart from in the biomedical area, they will go into denial. They have gone into denial about this. So that it's incumbent upon the government to do it, but you've got to give them, it is a tricky thing. They have a lot of the media against them. They will be labelled as deniers, like Scott Pruitt will have done, just for wanting a fair system. So it is a tricky thing to do. So that's why it's up to other organisations to actually try to precipitate this and show that the system is broken, and perhaps eventually the governments will do something about it.
Just on that, if I could just get Jaco Vlock to stand up. He helped me write chapter 10, and thank you so much, Jaco. He is somebody who is within the university system, and he doesn't care what's politically correct. He wants to get to the bottom of the whole issue of what our historical temperature, a proper historical temperature reconstruction for Australia would and should look like, and he's got the skills to do it, and he's only started recently, but he's doing a great job, and we need people of integrity who are prepared to question because they care about the truth.
Do we... my conclusion, frankly, from all of this is that peer review... now, I'm not going to say exactly what I think it is because we're recording, but that peer review is not worth very much. Do we think that as an idea, as a concept within science, that it should actually just be abandoned?
No, peer review is a great start, right? It's a great just first check. But then if you're going to, and only if you're going to spend a lot of cash on it, then you need to do more, right? That's what companies do. If I as a scientist reckon I invented a great new metal that would be great in jet engines, Rolls-Royce would come along and say, well, that's very interesting that it's been peer-reviewed. Now we're going to check it and test it, and we're going to hammer this thing and see whether we're going to put it in the back of the aeroplane, back of our jet engine. What the government will do on similar sort of research, peer-reviewed science, is they'll just believe it and spend $1 billion, right? Rolls-Royce will say, no, we're going to have people falling out of the sky. So we've got to look at the way that the engineers do it. Scientists have actually got not a clue about quality assurance, where the engineers do. And I'm a scientist, okay?
So look, I think I might have said this before, but the book is for sale tonight for $29.95. Jennifer and Peter are both here tonight to sign the book. And that's an opportunity that you will only get tonight. All of the science is in the book, as you'll read once you buy a copy for yourself and copies for your children and grandchildren. But I just wanted to ask, going beyond the science and some of the arguments that you make, both of you personally have taken risks in your own careers in pursuing what you know to be the truth, what you believe to be the truth. I wanted to ask you each individually what your own experiences have been, why it is that you've pursued these things in the way that you have, given the costs that inevitably come with going against the trend when it comes to some of these issues. Jennifer, first to you, on homogenisation in particular, why is it that you've taken some of those risks personally?
I would like to understand the climate history of Australia. For me, it's a bit of a puzzle that needs to be solved. And when I realised how inaccurate the official record was, I was keen to start solving the puzzle. And when I found that there were some places like Rutherglen that really showed how blatantly dishonest the reconstructions are, I then thought, well, this is going to be easy. We'll just put this idea out. We'll document it in a little report and send it off to the Auditor General, and get an audit done. But apparently, there's this concern that if the Bureau was audited, they may not look so good. I mean, I just find that extraordinary. And then there's also the concern that people might start to question the theory of anthropogenic global warming. I mean, I just find that extraordinary. So I guess I am motivated by the truth, and I love puzzle solving, and I'm very honoured to have been supported for a very long time in this by Bryant McPhee financially supported, and also supported by the IPA. So I thank you both. I thank the IPA as an organisation, and John Roscombe in particular, and I thank Brian McPhee so much for his support over and belief in myself and others over a long period of time.
And Peter, you've taken risks not only in a general sense, but in the tea room around work.
Yeah, a little bit, but
you've had a couple of issues.
Nothing like what Jen has done. I mean, Jen has been almost crucified by what's happened to her has been terrible, and what's happened with Bob Carter was terrible. My university is very, very understanding, and. So I think there actually might be something a little bit special about James Cook University, because yes, I have been slapped over the wrist, and I believe I have been threatened effectively with dismissal, but there's been enough people in the academy there who stood by me, and they supported me, and they saved my bacon, and I'm very grateful for those people. Now, I think what both us, Tick, and Bob, is that we just get pinged off when we see stuff which is palpably false, and we just can't keep our lips shut. In the end, that's what it boils down to. You just can't stand it because it just makes you angry.
Are you able to explain, so that extraordinary graph, the comparison between the work that had been done previously by Death,
Yes.
And your own work,
Yes.
and is there a way to explain to us why that is?
Why there's a difference?
Why there's such a distinction? Yeah.
Well, the first main problem was that they just stuffed up some of the measurements. So what they do is they drill holes in the coral, and they look at the bands like tree rings, and they kept on messing up the last one. They didn't. They denied it, and they denied it, and they denied it, but eventually they had to admit, yes, they did stuff it up.
Well, as Jennifer has said, they're the deniers.
Yeah, that's right. But there was another problem, that a bit like the Michael Mann hockey stick curve, very similar. They had actually two separate series. So there was the old stuff and the new stuff. One was using big corals, one was using small corals, and they essentially just couldn't do that. So there was another problem with the methodology.
And there's quite a bit written actually in chapter 1 of the book, specifically about this, with the charts and some actual references, so you can actually read much more about it from the references in this book.
Thank you. And I've just got one final question before we move to a very secret speaker who will deliver the vote of thanks. And that is to say, what's the next project for both of you? Where do we go from here in terms of the political climate? What do you think needs to happen, either from a scientific perspective or from a policy and political perspective?
Red team, blue teams. That's what we've got to go for. We've got to go for that.
And Jennifer?
I think that's a great idea. I would like to keep doing research because I really love puzzle solving. So I'd like to continue to be supported to do research, and I hope that people really promote this book, because you're not going to get to read a lot of the authors in this book anywhere else, and I'm going to just keep promoting this book for the next year or so, and please, everybody else, buy lots of copies.
Thank you very much. And speaking of promoting the book, in a moment I'll be heading up to Macquarie Park, which is where the Sky News studio is, to go and speak with Andrew Bolt to talk about the importance of this book and to talk about why people should go and purchase a copy for $29.95. They don't have the opportunity, the audience of the Bolt Report won't have the same opportunity that all of you in this room do, to have both Jennifer, the editor of the book, and Peter Ridd, one of the authors of one of the chapters in this book, to have the book signed. But I'm sure they'll go online to ipa.org.au and buy a copy themselves. The final thing that we have to do tonight, as I said, we've got a very special guest in the room tonight who I'd like to introduce to come and deliver the vote of thanks. Maurice Newman is someone who has been a great fighter for freedom in this country for many, many years. He truly is a man who needs no introduction, so I won't do it. Maurice, please come and join me up on the stage.
Thank you, Simon. Is Alan Jones still in the room? Because I wanted to say, first of all, thank you to him for being here. He has been an absolute tireless champion, not only in relation to the promotion of this book, but all the way through. And he receives a lot of the criticism and ridicule that is sort of part and parcel of what this debate is about. I'm conscious of the fact that this Climate Change, the Facts 2017, is a very skillfully collated reference book. And it should appeal, and I'm sure will appeal, to all those who are genuinely interested in the climate science facts. In particular, of course, it ought to be on every ABC, SBS, Fairfax, Guardian, school and university bookshelf. But we know that it won't. They prefer the officially sanctioned apocalyptic view of climate change, which was captured in Al Gore's latest movie, An Inconvenient Sequel. And of course, that was replete with compulsory, scary weather videos and Mr. Gore reminding us again that we're at a tipping point with the result that our children will inherit a world, quote, of stronger storms, worsening floods, deeper droughts, mega fires, tropical diseases spreading through vulnerable populations in all parts of the earth, melting ice caps, flooding coastal cities, unsurvivable heat extremes, and hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And of course, facts don't stand in the way of a good story, but most of those who will consider this a must-see movie will take delight in having their fantasies and their prejudices confirmed. Now, while publicly politicians refuse to discuss climate science, they feast on its alarmism. But with books like this, they will not forever be able to feign ignorance of the scientific fraud which is deeply embedded at its core. And once evidence-based science becomes established as a new normal, the greatest moral challenge of our generation simply falls away. And with it, the compelling reason for the elite to meddle in everybody's lives and to waste billions of our money. Author Tom Clancy is right. The control of information is something the elite always does, particularly in a despotic form of government. So this publication will be denied the exposure it deserves because it is a direct challenge to climate orthodoxy, and for this its authors will be made to suffer bullying and relentless attacks on their professional reputations. I mean, Bjorn Lomborg, whose chapter analyses the futility of the Paris Agreement, is no stranger to this. His attempts to establish a policy centre within an Australian university was rejected purely on academic grounds. He came with a cheque for $4 million. He was rejected from every university, not just the University of WA. Attempts to set something up within other universities, rejected. Professor Peter Ridd, as we've heard tonight, was also on the wrong side of university groupthink. His crime was failing to act in a collegial way and in the academic spirit of the institution. In other words, countering the party line and taking a stand on quality assurance is unacceptable conduct. Jennifer Marohasy, as we've heard, is another persecutor for daring to challenge the establishment. Her forensic analysis strongly indicates the Bureau of Meteorology scientists are manipulating or homogenising the observed data to justify their model results. She has been met with stonewalling and hostility. And rather than clear the air by disclosing the key algorithms, the Bureau, as we heard tonight, colluded with the government to obstruct an independent forensic examination of its treatment of national temperature data because of what it would mean to the Bureau's reputation. No kidding. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. Professor Ridd's role as an evidence-based scientist is a constant target for emotion-charged climate change charlatans. The Barrier Reef is a totemic environmental issue which, under the cloak of academic authority, is regularly subjected to junk science, passing uncritically into the mainstream media as credible research. And Peter Ridd should be deeply thanked for being such a reliable and rational gatekeeper. I'm really very pleased that this book is dedicated to the late Professor Bob Carter and enhanced by his chapter on the geological record. We miss him deeply. Bob was a stickler, as we all know, for scientific rigour and unafraid to take on those who cling to the comfort of consensus, and he deserves our posthumous thanks. Before I say thank you to our speakers, may I first give special thanks to the IPA's John Roscombe and Scott Hargraves, because their determination, their foresight, and their sense of public service to see this book through to publication does deserve special recognition. Without them, we wouldn't be celebrating this book tonight. Our gratitude to Jennifer is very, very profound to you, because not only have you made a major contribution to the book, but you have assembled such a marvellous mix of scientists and subject matter which has all been edited with great skill. And could I say to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. This is we are really privileged to be in this room tonight. This is a significant event. And I might add that it says something about where we are, that we had to hold the event with personal safety in mind, and hence there was very limited publicity about where and when this event was going to be held. Now, you wouldn't believe that we could have fallen so far, yet we have. So, like it or not, this evening is not only about scientific integrity, but it's also about the freedom of thought and the freedom of speech. And that you have turned up in such numbers is itself a very, very valuable and extremely encouraging development. So thank you again. Finally, thank you to all our speakers, thank you to all of the contributors for making this such an outstanding evening and for shining a light into a world which is consumed by darkness. We can only hope that in time the public will look back and pay homage to your great scholarship and courage, because it will mean that we have rediscovered the Enlightenment. So let's go out and make this book a bestseller. Thank you.
Thank you, Morris. I think that was a wonderful vote of thanks. But of course, we have to thank you also. So as a small token of our gratitude, we have some wine for our two wonderful scientists tonight and authors and editors of the book, and also for you, Morris. Thank you very much to the three of you for joining us tonight at this very special celebration. Now, I'm not sure if I've mentioned tonight, but the book is on sale outside for $29.95. Jennifer and Peter will be signing the book at this table to my right over here. If you haven't yet joined the IPA, we have a very special offer for $99 you can join for 18 months. Now, I'm not quite as good at mathematics as some of the other scientists who are joining us in this room tonight, but that's under $100. So that's terrific value. Please join the IPA. Please support integrity in science. Please support freedom of speech. And please, as some of our guests have already started doing, go and get your book signed tonight. Thank you for joining us.